What do people look for in a donor?
Many of the women would say, "What does he look like?" You would just try and describe what the donor looked like. Who do you have that's like Paul Walker?
Family building is supposed to be easy, and it can be a shock when it's not. The roller coaster ride of infertility can be a mix of emotions and conflicting advice along the way. As a reproductive endocrinologist and former fertility patient, I not only help patients build families every day, but I remember what the ride was like for me. Hang on tight as we learn together from experts and share stories from infertility warriors with compassion. I'm your host, Dr. Lora Shahine, and this is Baby or Bust. Building a family with donor sperm is more common today than ever. We've seen movies like The Switch with Jennifer Aniston and Jason Bateman, and real-life celebrities like Natalie Imbruglia and Monica Cruz using donor sperm to have their family. But this family building option has not always been accepted or available. As recently as the 1950s, laws in the United States considered using donor sperm a form of adultery and children born illegitimate. In 1973, the American Bar Association approved the Uniform Parentage Act, legalizing family building with donor sperm and protecting everyone involved in the process. Just a few years later, the United States saw its first commercial sperm bank, and we have the founder here today. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Cappy Rothman, the father of modern sperm donation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your interest.
You have truly helped build thousands of families. I believe you estimated 260,000 children?
At least, yes.
At least. Incredible. You know, I've been helping people build families for about 15 years. And in my career, sperm donation has always been available. I take it a little bit for granted because it's always been available to me. And that's not the case. You truly are a part of making that available. Please tell me how you opened up the first sperm bank in the United States.
In the 1950s, I think Lancet, which is a medical journal from the UK, published an article on sperm banking, and it was really not received well by the public. They wanted to make it actually illegal. The church now spoke out about how terrible it was. It should be considered a criminal offense. And you're right, it wasn't until the 1970s with the Parentage Act that sperm banking became accepted. It was truly frowned upon. Legally, medically, ethically, culturally, religiously, they were really chastised. And through most of the time, until recently, to the 1980s, sperm bank was looked somewhat unfavorably, and artificial insemination with donor was also looked at with suspicion and as a societal problem.
I am fortunate in my practice to take for granted the availability of donor sperm and the fact that it's a part of pop culture and in movies, and it's something that's easily talked about. And it's an incredible option for so many of my families. But I know that it's not always been the case.
Since social media, Nathan, who is a young man who is one of 32 children from a donor, 5114. Nathan, when he was young, he was probably about 13, 14, got a call from an unknown young girl and said, "Are you Nathan Savinari?" He says, "Yes." She says, "You're my brother." So Nathan went to his mother and said, "I had this girl call me up and said I'm her brother," at which time her mother told him that he was a product of donor sperm from the California Cryobank. Now, Nathan's grandmother and I were friendly. She told me the story, and she said that 8 of the kids are going to get together and meet one another. So I asked my son, and I said, "Michael, I would like to know what happens at this gathering." Because the sperm bank wasn't interested in following up the bureaucracy. So he went there and met the kids and really enjoyed it. And that's probably the first time, he was probably 42, that he ever realized what I do and was proud of me.
Wonderful. So tell me a little bit about starting the California Cryobank.
I spent 9 months studying sperm and the transportation of sperm, and I found it one of the most fantastic cells in the body. I mean, here's one of the few cells that it actually has a choice. When ejaculated intravaginally, it could hang around there. It could go to the uterus, it could hang around there. It could probably survive in that environment up to 48 hours, or it could find an egg and become a person. Some women would have 2 operative procedures before her husband was even asked to give a semen analysis. Some women would be on birth control for 10 years, and her husband was sterile. So there was really a tremendous bias for who would be responsible for infertility. To bring up to date, now we know it's about 50-50, but it took a long time for that 50% to become recognized as a potential etiology of infertility.
And we still see that culturally, Cappy. I still see patients in my own practice that the women blame themselves for being infertile or for having miscarriages. The male partners sometimes are very reluctant to give sperm samples. It's gotten much better than what you describe, but that still inherent bias is still present. And I'm glad that you're talking about it.
Getting back to the 1970s, if a couple was infertile, there was really very few options. So if a couple was infertile, it was devastating. And I had a lot of couples that would sit in front of me where the woman would be teary and cry and angry, and she would look at her husband and say, "Because I married you, I will never be a mother." And the guy is absolutely devastated, and he looks pleadingly. He says, "I get an erection, I have an ejaculation. I never knew that there was any issue." And we were unable to help as many men as we can today. Then I was sought after. I was the only urologist in LA that specialized in male infertility. It didn't happen gradually. It basically happened within the first 6 or 7 months of the practice once the word got out. And I started lecturing about it, and I started being a strong advocate of it. But because of the couple sitting in front of me where the man was devastated, I said, "Well, if you want, we could try donor sperm." And they accepted it quite easily. The women immediately, the men with some hesitancy. But this is the beginning of it, and this is why I started the sperm bank, as a way for infertile couples to conceive when it was a male factor. And right now, we distribute to every state in the United States and 40 countries outside the United States. We usually distribute about 32 to 34,000 ampules of sperm every year all over the world. But it was just a gradual growth because we were more interested in service than finance. I don't feel like I've ever worked. I mean, all of it was just more exciting and more fun, and I would keep semen samples in my desk for weeks. And one of the things that was nice is there was very little bureaucracy because it was mostly anonymous, because the men were a little bit embarrassed, and frequently nobody knew. It wasn't our decision, it was their decision, and they would do it and say, "But you got to promise you won't tell anybody."
So, Cappy, in the beginning, you're talking about that a lot of donation was anonymous, and a lot of donors really assumed that they would be anonymous forever. And a lot of your original donors could have never foreseen modern day genetic testing like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, where people are finding genetic relatives online, and some discovering that their biological parents are not the parents that raised them. Could you have ever imagined that this would come to the forefront?
No, it really did. It didn't just come to the forefront. I think it exploded the front, because the recognition that, unfortunately, Some of the doctors became their own donors if the expected donor didn't show up. And we had something called a sibling registry. So if a woman had a child from one of the donors, she could register, and then if there were any other women in the world who also had a child, they could get together. It kind of did away with anonymity, and that's when the single women started having families without being married, and lesbian couples now wanted children.
Yeah.
So that's our largest population now. It used to be married couples. Now it's mostly single women and lesbian couples.
Today, the mindset is people usually want donors that are willing to be open about their donation, allow the children to contact them when the children turn 18. But back when you started in the 70s, this was so close to a generation that really looked down on any sort of artificial insemination or having a baby in any way that wasn't considered, traditional or natural. And it's just really interesting to see that change. What do people look for in a donor?
Probably the same thing a woman would look for in a husband. We inadvertently put something in called celebrity look-alike, because many of the women would say, well, what's he look like? Well, they got a nose like Tom Cruise, he got a chin like Victor Mature, and you would just go and try and describe what the donor looked like. Paul Walker was the appearance of him was the most sought-after donor. Who do you have that's like Paul Walker?
That's funny, because when I talk to patients about donor sperm, they tell me that they want a donor that's very similar to their partner.
If it's a couple that are married, we usually try and match the donor with the husband as close as we can, with his eye color, with his skin tone, his height. All of our donors, by the way, they're in college, 4-year college or college graduates. A consistently important part of donor selection is education, and that was probably the first choice. The second one would be the physical appearance.
So, Cappy, how many times can a sperm donor donate?
It's not how many times he could donate per se, but how many ampules of sperm actually store for him and how many children could be born. And what we've tried to do is limit it to 25 family units. So in other words, a donor could even have 75 children if each of the 25 families have 3 children, which is usually not the case.
One thing that I'd like to point out is I think there's an assumption in the public that sperm banks are regulated, that the federal government is sort of overseeing things. And there is some regulation today, but I'd just like to point out that you, as the owner of the California Cryobank, really instilled some of the testing that has become standard by the FDA, but you did it before it was a requirement. You did it as a way to protect the people that were using this sperm. Is that correct?
That's correct. As a matter of fact, the FDA came to us for developing their guidelines.
What kind of information do you get from donors? And medical history, psychiatric evaluation, genetic screening?
Well, infectious diseases, metabolic studies, physical examination. Conceptually, it's easier to get into Harvard Medical School than to become a donor at the California Cryobank.
There's a controversial case from a different sperm bank in the United States where a donor really falsified some medical information, including a mental health history. And it was discovered because the sperm bank actually accidentally released his name. I'm just wondering how you counsel people about the level of trust and how much, information we have to trust the donors are giving us.
We're very careful. The donors are seen every time they come in. The donor coordinators know them quite well. They have a physical examination every 6 months, and they have a good relationship with the donor coordinators. So if they break up with their girlfriend and have a new girlfriend, we want to know about it. If they have a tattoo, we want to know about it. Is the tattoo parlor a certified parlor? So we're very careful, just because the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. But the people that are objected to it, we're not sitting at that desk and seeing the devastation of the couple because they're infertile. But I was. So I knew they didn't have any alternatives. You couldn't adopt, no IVF.
I read your journal article published in 1980 about the very first post-mortem sperm collection.
Yes.
And I would love to hear that story.
I'm in the office and I get a call from the neurosurgical resident at UCLA and said Senator Cranston's son was in an accident. He has brain damage and he's going to die, and they're going to use him as an organ transplant. He says, but the senator would like somebody to collect the sperm. So this is going back to about 1978, 79. So I went over there and I met the senator, and I remember we talked about what he wanted and what I could do. And he says, how much are you going to charge me? And I said, basically nothing, because I don't even know if I could do it. So I waited there until they removed everything, the hearts, the lungs, the long bone, the liver. And then when they were all through, I was there by myself. I felt like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci. Here I had a cadaver, and all of a sudden I could work and really learn the anatomy that I haven't seen since medical school. So I published the article, A Method of Obtaining Viable Sperm in a Postmortem State. And when you write an article, they give you like 500 copies of it. I think the 500 copies went for the first 2 or 3 hours. Then I started printing my own. There was such a request. It turned out to be a very interesting subject. And it was the first time it was ever done. We could remove all of the anatomy that has sperm, or we could manually masturbate. And I remember the resident on the phone, he says, Doc, I've been asked to do a lot of things as a chief resident, but if you think I'm going to jerk off a dead man, you're crazy. I said, okay, we now have 2 options, and that's when I did remove the sperm.
This was the first time that anybody had discovered that sperm can be alive and viable after someone has died.
Yes. After I published the article, I got a call, and this is maybe a year later or a year and a half later, from an attorney in Boston, a Chinese woman who asked if I would be able to retrieve her brother's sperm because he was the last male heir of the family. And in the office, I opened up the epididymis. I found viable sperm. I put it under the microscope. I asked them to take a look. The mother looked. Tears came to her eyes. She gave me a kiss on the cheek and tipped me $20.
Yeah.
That's what I'll be noted for more than anything else. The first doctor that's ever collected sperm from a dead person that ultimately resulted in a pregnancy.
And I know you have a pretty colorful past.
My father was in Cuba and actually had a nightclub, gambling casino, the Sanssouci, which I spent my summers there. And with the revolution, he ultimately left. There's a lot of stories going on. But I remember one of the things, I was with George Raft in an elevator, and all of a sudden we heard machine gun fire, and we both actually laid on the floor of the elevator. But Cuba was very exciting at that time, during the time of Batista. I happened to have met Batista, and after the revolution, when people left Cuba quickly, they took money. They took millions and millions of dollars. And then they were going to convert the money. Then Castro said, in 6 months, I'm no longer going to accept Batista's money. I'm making my own. So the market for Batista dollars became compromised, and I was one of the people that was actually a courier. And I remember going to the Waldorf Astoria for Batista's wife, because she was supposed to get some of the money. I was friendly with Batista's son, Jorge. And growing up in Cuba was just, what an exciting time that was. Started when I was 12 and left when I was about 18, 19. Being a young man, and his father had a nightclub, gambling casino, it was fun. I look back now and I could just say, wow. I remember everybody carried 45s. So that was exciting. My father was friendly with Hoffa.
And so you mean Jimmy Hoffa, the union leader?
Mm-hmm. So I was working for Jimmy Hoffa. I was in his office, and we would have lunch together because he really liked my dad, and I found him wonderful. I remember he would stand in front of the window looking at the White House, and you could see the Capitol, and he says, "That bastard Bobby," meaning Bobby Kennedy. And he'd look and he says, he's probably standing at his window and saying, "That bastard Jimmy."
You have lived several lives, Cappy. Just absolutely incredible.
No, but being responsible for the births of about 260,000 children is just a remarkable achievement.
You know, there's so many different ways to build a family, and it's just such a gift that you've provided.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining our conversation today with Dr. Cappy Rothman, where we reviewed the history and heritage of fertility sciences and advanced reproductive technology, and really celebrated all of the options that are available for family building for you today. I'm your host, Dr. Lora Shahine, and this is Baby or Bust. If you like this episode, let us know. Give us a 5-star review and follow the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Baby or Bust is produced by Mark Ramsey, Jamie Solis, and Greg Moga. Executive produced by Paul Anderson, Nick Pinella, and Andrew Greenwood for Workhouse Media. Baby or Bust is a Mark Ramsey media production.